That was easy. What a well-behaved audience. Sound immediately drops. People move to the front. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to everybody in the room and also those joining us online today. My name is Melanie Feinberg. I'm the Executive Marketing Manager at VicHealth. Our event is being held on the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and I would like to acknowledge them as traditional owners. I'd also like to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and any Aboriginal elders from other communities that are here with us today. I am delighted to be your MC for today's very special event, Australia in 2030, What is our path forward for better health for all? The COVID-19 pandemic has heightened dissatisfaction among health and community sectors about the lack of progress to address health inequities, and it has spurred them on to further drive meaningful change. VicHealth partnered with the Medical Journal of Australia on a supplement to explore key issues and to help inform future planning for a healthier Australia and Victoria. Published on Monday, the supplement, which I have here hot off the presses, look fantastic, contains 7 really thought-provoking chapters, focusing on areas including planetary health in policy action, the implications of the digital revolution on human health, and the need to embed Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander cultural knowledge into public health practices. Today, we will hear from contributors to the supplement as well as hearing voices from the local community. During our panel discussion, we will attempt to unpack and further immerse ourselves in what needs to happen in order to achieve the ambition of healthier future by 2030 for all. Before we begin, I do need to mention just a few housekeeping matters for those of us in the room. If you haven't already, please check in using the QR code that's at the entry. Bathrooms are located to your right. And following the formalities at 11, we ask you to just stay behind, join us for a few light refreshments before we wrap up and head off on our days at 11:30. And for everybody joining us today, including those online, for our Q&A with the panel, we'll be taking all of our questions from Slido today. So during the panel discussion, we invite you to write your questions and vote for your favourite ones, and leave comments if you also like for our panel members. You simply head to the Slido website, use the hashtag Australia in 2030 to join today's event and comment. Make sure you use an uppercase A and I to get into the event. Once in the Q&A part of Slido, then you can submit your question or vote for your favourite one so that it gets up to the top and gets asked. Now, to officially welcome you all, I'd like to invite to the stage VicHealth CEO, Dr. Sandro Di Meo.
Thanks. Good morning, everyone. I too would like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land that we're on here at beautiful Federation Square on the banks of the Yarra in Melbourne, and also the lands wherever you are around Victoria, Australia or beyond. For us, it's the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and I'd like to pay respects to elders past, present and emerging, and acknowledge that these lands always were and always will be Aboriginal lands. I'd also like to acknowledge the leadership and presence of someone May Finlay, who led the chapter on Aboriginal health, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander health, and the continued leadership that you provide here across the nation in public health. Guests, authors, colleagues, friends, it is kind of like getting the band back together this morning. There's so many familiar faces, and a few people said on the way in, it's nice to be back in person. It is, after the year that we've had, being able to come back as a community and have big discussions about our future. I think more than ever, it's so clear what a privilege that is in so many dimensions, not just a privilege of where we sit as Australians, financial, economic privilege that we have relative to so many doing it so tough around the world, but also from an epidemiological perspective and the hard work done by so many in our community, but also across all communities to get us to where we are at this point in 2021. Welcome, come in, sit down. I'd also like to just pay a big special thank you to our authors, nearly 60 of them who have worked hard over the last 12 months to put this supplement together. We call it a VicHealth supplement, but it's really not. It belongs to all of the authors. It's their thoughts, their words, their leadership. And we, particularly to, again, Summer, to Kathryn and to Rebecca, who are here with us today, but I know a number of authors are tuning in online. A big thank you to them. Where we stand at the beginning of 2021, clearly we're at a critical crossroads as a global community, but also as Australians and as in Australia. If we think about the commitments we've made to 2030, the Sustainable Development Goals, the commitment we made as a nation, one of 190 or so nations around the world back in 2015, of sustainable development and fundamentally to leaving no one behind by 2030, we have a long way to go. In fact, since 2015, when we switched the clock over from the Millennium Development Goals to the Sustainable Development Goals, which made this roadmap for global sustainable development so much more relevant, meaningful, but also a commitment, a true commitment from and for Australia. Since then, we've seen most of the major global trends go in the opposite direction to where we want them to be. And in fact, early in the pandemic, many were saying that, coronavirus may be the great leveller. It may be the thing that narrows global widening, long-standing widening global inequality and inequity. And we know now, 12 months, 18 months in, that it's certainly not that if anything, it's the great accelerator. It's simply accelerated all of the trends and challenges, and it's made so clear the deep inequities and the cracks of inequity across and within society that we had at best papered over for many decades. But at the same time, the pandemic has shown us what the strengths of the Victorian and Australian communities. It's shown us what we can do. It's shown us what governments can do. We've been able to invest heavily in social housing. We've been able to really critically look at the vulnerabilities of insecure work. We've been able to rethink the way we work. We've been able to have critical conversations about food, and not just food insecurity from a perspective of calories, but from a perspective of dignity and inclusion. And I think as a community, more broadly, it's brought up some really important and long coming conversations as a society. And so as we look out to 2030 and the enormous amount of work we have in the next 9 years to achieve what we've all committed to of leaving no one behind, we find ourselves realising more than ever, although the framing we're currently using is no one is safe until everyone is safe, that actually we have to close and narrow and eliminate the enormous disparities between where we stand today on so many of these big issues facing our society that ultimately have an enormous impact on health and where we need to be by the close of this decade. But finally, there are also some big opportunities. I was reflecting just this week, as many of you probably have a degree in epidemiology, and as many of you have had conversations many times that go along something like this. I have a degree in epidemiology. Oh, that's great. Bugs. Awesome. Let's talk about beetles. It's like, okay. And then you sort of let the conversation go, because let's be honest, beetles are actually very interesting and probably more interesting than my PhD. Now it seems like everyone's an epidemiologist, which comes with its own challenges. But I think the opportunity that the world really truly understands for the first time in a century, the power and insight and leadership that the public health community can and is providing, the importance of lived experience and academic expertise from professors to community leaders. The fact that health is for the first time in so long front of mind, and the fact that governments of all colours and persuasions are making very bold and in some cases very progressive policy moves that we thought would take decades, whether that's in England around child obesity, whether that's in Latin America around food policy, whether that's closer to home, as I mentioned, in social housing, or indeed the decade of progress we've made on access to telehealth, although again, digital equity and all sorts of other challenges do still prevail. So we see this supplement as a very important contribution to the global and also national discussions as we go into recovery, hopefully, a long and sustained recovery as we emerge from the global pandemic. And as we think, really critically and deeply about how we reimagine our societies, how we hold on to the small silver linings, but how we really learn from the last 12 months. And the fact that it's been, issues like social determinants that were previously politically inconvenient have become politically unavoidable. The supplements outline 7 critical chapters, as I mentioned, from 60 of the nation's authors, and really the question that we pose to them and that they have well and truly delivered, is how do we set Australia off on a trajectory to achieve health for all by 2030, to achieve our commitments to the SDGs and ensure that we leave no Australian behind, and through our global commitments, contribute to a healthier, fairer and more sustainable world. Finally, I'd just like to thank the team that put it all together, the VicHealth team. Thank you for the enormous amount of work behind the scenes, as well as the media and communications team in bringing these conversations to life across the airwaves, online and on TV across this week. Let's keep the conversation going, bless you. Let's keep sharing the content and making sure that this doesn't just end today with an extra 36 pages of paper on your shelf. I'd like to thank all of you for being here. I'd like to thank the authors first and foremost, and finally just also a thank you to our panellists for making the time to come down this morning. You're a recent addition to this journey, but a critical part as we now look to the translation of these words and ideas into impact and benefit for Victorians, Australians and beyond. Thank you and enjoy the rest of the morning.
Fantastic. Thank you, Sandro. It's now my pleasure to welcome Dr. Summer Finlay, a proud Yorta Yorta woman and lecturer from the University of Wollongong. Dr. Finlay co-authored Chapter 2 in our supplement, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Connection to Culture, Building Stronger Individual and Collective Wellbeing. Please make her welcome.
Hi, I have the privilege of speaking first, so bear with me for a second. There we go. Before I start, I'd just like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands we're meeting on today and pay my respects to elders past and present. It's always a privilege to be standing up here and talking about something like the cultural determinants of health as an Aboriginal woman. This is something that I know that my mum and my grandmother and my ancestors would not have had the privilege of doing. So I'm very acutely aware that this is something that is a burden but also a responsibility that I hope I do justice to in the 6 minutes that I have. And can I just say to you that our culture is over 60,000 years old, so 6 minutes will give you a tiny, tiny glimpse. The paper will give you a little bit more, and hopefully there's more to come down the track. So just a little bit about myself. I am a Yorta Yorta woman. You can see at the top there, that's my country. But I didn't grow up on country. Like a lot of Aboriginal people, I didn't grow up on my country, but of course I'm very aware and connected to my country, and I probably have a lot more learning to do in that space as well. So again, I am Victorian by heritage, but I am New South Wales by birth. So sometimes that is a fraught position to be in. So the chapter was looking at the cultural determinants of health. So for those that don't know, the cultural determinants are all of the things that actually our culture impacts from a health perspective, which is not dissimilar to the social determinants of health being all of those things that impact our health as well. So I have to first acknowledge, before I go any further, of course, the amazing authors that actually created this publication with me, with this chapter. There is no way I could have done this without them. I won't read their names, they are in the chapter, but I do want to make sure that they get the recognition, because only one of us could stand up here today, but they all should be standing here with me. The other thing that I want to note to you is that each and every one of these authors are Aboriginal and or Torres Strait Islander. So we have 2 Torres Strait Islander authors and 3 Aboriginal authors. When I took this on, as the team knows, I felt very strongly, as did a number of other people who supported me through this, that this should be a paper written by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. And this paper goes to the fact that we know our culture, and we are best placed to actually determine how that culture needs to be embedded in policy, program and research. We have non-Aboriginal allies, which are fantastic, and we need them, but ultimately the cultural leadership needs to come from our communities. And so, the cultural determinants of health have always been embedded in the Aboriginal definition of health. So this definition of health comes from the 1989 National Aboriginal Health Strategy, which looks at, rather than just individual health, but collective health as well. It looks at our spiritual health and looks at our cultural health and how all of those things need to align for an individual and a community to be healthy. And despite the fact that this has been referenced in, say, the National Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Health Plan, and also as far back as 1989, the implementation has been challenging. The implementation has been challenging for the very reason I was talking about before. We have not had Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander leadership allowed the opportunity to actually lead this space. What we've seen is often very much very well-meaning non-Aboriginal people working in our space, but they don't have the cultural lens that our communities have. And when I talk about community, it could be on a national scale, or it could be a local community within your sphere. So when we're talking about national policy, obviously there needs to be a national approach, and that will mean multiple communities. But at a local level, it really needs to be local people. And again, the cultural definition of health is up there for you, and it's in the chapter. But again, it's a strengths-based approach, which is looking at how we think as Aboriginal people, how we move through the world as Aboriginal people, and how we do business. So it's all of those things that really kind of are the intangibles. You will see culture often presented in a really performative way through smoking ceremonies, through cultural dances, which is fantastic, and that is a key component of our cultural expression. But often what you're not seeing is the intangibles inside us, which is what we actually need to express through the cultural determinants of health being embedded in research and policy. I talk to my students, and they probably are sick of hearing it, but it's like that iceberg analogy. You see this tiny little bit on the top, which is what we show and see in an expressive way, but then it's everything else. It's our kinship, it is our language, it is our connection to country. So it's all of these things that are innate within us as a people that are often expressed in a way that you just can't see, but it's just the way we do business. And that's how we talk about it. It is just the way Aboriginal people do business. And COVID was a prime example of how when Aboriginal people are just left to do the business of taking care of our communities, which is something that the Aboriginal community controlled sector has been doing since the 1970s, you can see the results. Now, state governments and Commonwealth governments clearly had a role to play within this. They don't get the right to abdicate their responsibilities for Aboriginal people just because we do an amazing job at taking care of our communities. But the ACCHO's geared up as early as February and March to put out resources and health promotion resources, pandemic toolkits, to make sure that our communities were taken care of. They did that because they know their communities well. They know how to connect with their communities, and they know how to speak to their communities. So COVID, for a lot of people, has been a really challenging experience, and it has been for Aboriginal people, but it's also been an experience which has really demonstrated the strength within our sector as Aboriginal community-controlled health services and Aboriginal communities. When you have only 0.6% of the COVID cases being Aboriginal, despite the fact we're 3% of the population, despite the fact we have significant chronic diseases within our communities, that shows our responses have been successful. So I do think, in stealing Norman Swan's words, that the government should get out of the way, but they also need to resource and support us to do exactly what our communities know needs to be done. So the key focuses of the chapter have really been what I've summarised here, that we actually need Aboriginal leadership, We know that there's been a really strong social determinants of health approach, which is really, really important. But what we actually need is a cultural lens over all of that. So we need to be thinking about what it is Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people need from our perspective to make sure that we're actually achieving health for all by 2030. And to be honest with you, we've been, as Aboriginal people, talking about this before Closing the Gap, for example, with closing the gap in a generation by 2031. And quite frankly, we're not anywhere where we need to be, and we hopefully will see that with the leadership that we're actually going to have through the Closing the Gap. Now, I think I am over time, so I won't go into too much. I knew this was going to happen. But where to next? All I can say is if each of you as health professionals are actually making sure that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, and peoples, plural, more than one, because none of us are the fountain of all knowledge on Aboriginal people, actively are engaged in the work that you do, then we are damn sight going to be better off by 2030 than we are now. Anyway, that's me.
Thank you, Dr. Finlay. Our next author is Dr. Rebecca Patrick, Senior Lecturer from the Faculty of Health at Deakin University. Dr. Patrick contributed to Chapter 4 in the supplement, Promoting Planetary Health in the Anthropocene, an Ecological Determinants of Health Perspective. Please make her welcome.
I too would also like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands in which we're gathered today, and also thank my co-authors, many of you in the audience today, for your contributions to the thinking that led to the development of this chapter. And also to VicHealth for giving us an opportunity to contribute to this supplement. As stated, our contribution to this initiative is called Health Promotion in the Anthropocene, an Ecological Determinants of Health Perspective. In the chapter, we set out the latest evidence on the state of the natural environment and the links to human health. We highlight the health impacts of climate change in Australia and challenge Australia's position as a major fossil fuel producer and exporter. We offer a 4-point roadmap for action, which I will walk you through now. Let's look at the context, though, before we look at the actions. So we are living in a new era. Scientists and others call it the Anthropocene. It is an era marked by colossal and massive human pressures on the natural environment. This is significant because human health is dependent on the health of the natural environment. Our natural environment, as you know, provides us with the essential resources for living: fresh air, water, food, a stable, livable climate. We're actually hardwired for contact with nature, for social cultural connection to place, and contact with nature promotes our mental health and wellbeing. These are what we call the ecological determinants of health, and we unpack in the chapter. The figure on the slide shows the problem. We have crossed or close to crossing several planetary boundaries. We are now living with the deleterious human health impacts of climate change and atmospheric change, such as the respiratory and cardiovascular disease arising from air pollution, and likewise with biodiversity loss, which is associated with increasing infectious disease, and there's been links to COVID there. In Australia, 2020 catastrophic bushfires were fuelled by ongoing drought, extreme heat, low rainfall and strong winds. These are all conditions that are arising from a changing climate. Approximately 80% of Australians were affected either directly or indirectly by the bushfires, with 33 deaths, 3,000 homes lost, more than 17 million hectares burnt, and losses of over 1 billion mammals, birds and reptiles. The health costs of bushfire smoke alone were estimated at 1.95 billion Australian dollars. So So how can we respond? Here's the first of our 4 directions. And the directions described at the top of the slide. Influencing Australia's actions on fossil fuel development and decarbonising our economy are the most urgent and far-reaching challenges this decade. In direction 1, we assert that we need clear policy and government direction to support this rapid transition to sustainable living, and for taking the health and environmentally harming carbon emissions out of our economy. The good news is we already have policy blueprints for this directive. For example, the Climate and Health Alliance has developed a national framework for climate health and wellbeing in consultation with hundreds of health professionals, organisations and decision makers across Australia. What we do need is the federal government to pick up and run with it. Direction 2, we call for a reset of health promotion frameworks. For example, Planetary health thinking builds on Indigenous people's knowledge systems. Whilst absolutely recognising Indigenous people are diverse and worldviews are specific to people and place, at the core of Indigenous knowledge systems is collective responsibility for the stewardship and appreciation of Earth as a living entity, and connection to country is essential for wellbeing. Engaging with Indigenous knowledge systems will help us to build effective responses to the challenges of the Anthropocene and enhance intergenerational health equity. Direction 3 this slide provides several examples of leadership for planetary health arising from the public health and health promotion sector. Kiriwat Regional Health Service is depicted in the left-hand side of the slide. They have a leading evaluation work of programs arising from health promotion, and they've demonstrated the positive health and environmental impacts of a men's shed program that's co-located with their health service. The Australian Health Promotion Association and the Climate Health Alliance teamed up in 2020 to provide a workforce development session for workers across Australia on the mental health benefits of contact with nature. Importantly, to be credible in influencing and leading change, all health organisations need to articulate their own vision and strategies for promoting planetary health and achieving net zero emissions. And on direction 4. Nature-based health interventions simultaneously promote mental, social and physical health, and at the same time, they help people to appreciate and value their natural environments. We need to reorient our health programs and services to tap into the multiple benefits of contact with nature. So in closing, this is the critical decade. We have many of the solutions. The health sector is highly engaged in Australia. We need to continue to build on that momentum that's there. We must disinvest in fossil fuels, switch on renewable energy, and keep our commitments to the Paris Agreement, which at its core is a 21st century public health agreement. Thank you. Sorry.
Thank you, Dr. Patrick. I would now like to welcome Dr. Kathryn Backholer, couldn't find you there in the front row, Associate Professor from the Faculty of Health at Deakin University. Dr. Backholer is one of the authors of Chapter 6, Digital Determinants, the Digital Transformation.
Thank you. I'd also like to acknowledge the Indigenous leaders of the land in which we meet today and pay my respects to elders past and present. Thank VicHealth for putting this supplement together, and particularly thank my co-authors on the paper. So I'd like you all to cast your minds back to December 31st, 2019. For most of you, life would have seemed pretty normal, and the vast majority of you would never have heard of the word coronavirus before. Yet on that very day, and this is 9 days before the WHO notified the world of the emergence of a novel coronavirus, an artificial intelligence system had already detected the presence of an unknown pneumonia out of Wuhan, China. So using natural language processing techniques, so these are techniques that use text, recognise patterns in text, and scanning a range of data sources, including airline data, foreign language news reports, reports on animal and plant disease outbreaks. This automated system put up a red flag that there was this presence of an unknown pneumonia with an unknown etiology. And I start with this because I think there's no better way to illustrate the power of digital technologies than with the COVID pandemic, from the initial detection of the disease, which I just mentioned, all the way through to contact tracing and case identification, remote care, and prediction of the blueprint or the genetic information required for the messenger RNA vaccine and the printing of the vaccine itself. And so as someone who's interested in population health and public health, I'm really excited about the ways in which digital technologies, just change that slide, digital technologies is going to influence public health going forward, from disease detection, surveillance, from the identification of interventions and evaluation of those interventions, and informing health policy and practice. So just another example, researchers are now using social media platforms and applying machine learning algorithms to those, and they're able to detect or predict with a really high degree of accuracy mental illness such as depression, schizophrenia, suicidal ideation, just through those social media feeds. So we've got novel data sources, we've got advancing digital technologies which are really shaping our health and wellbeing, and will continue to do so in the future. But with opportunities come risks as well. And so what we focused on in this chapter are some of the challenges and what we need to do more in the future to make sure that these digital technologies benefit health in the most optimal way. And the first challenge I want to highlight is one of equity. And I think the MJA supplement is a great supplement because equity is that common thread through every single chapter in the supplement. And so there's 2 points I'll make with equity, and the first is digital inclusion. So we know that digital use, just like health, is socially and economically patterned. So we know that older Australians, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Australians, households with a lower income are less likely to be able to access technologies, to afford technologies, and in some cases to be able to utilise those technologies. So going forward, we need to make sure that digital inclusion is right up there in national agendas, economic decision-making, and strategic decision-making. The second part on equity is that we know that that our digital technologies are only as good as the data that underpins them, and algorithms that are based on limited or biased data can ingrain racial, cultural, and gender inequities. So there's no doubt that our future going forward, we need to think about how do we generate data that is diverse in perspectives, diverse in experiences, and diverse in participants, so that the benefits of those technologies benefit everyone. So another key challenge really ties to one of the other chapters in the MJA supplement around the commercial determinants of health. And we know that it's not just technologies that are being used to benefit health, but these industries that are harmful to health that are also using these technologies. We know that big food, alcohol, tobacco, gambling are not just using these technologies, but they're buying up entire tech firms so that they can embed technologies into absolutely everything that they do. To give you an example, there are places around the world where you walk into a fast food restaurant, your face will be scanned. That face recognition software will predict your age, your gender, and what mood you're in, all to influence your purchases when you make your way to the counter. And we know certainly in the marketing space that social media platforms are collecting the data from us, they're collecting the data from our children, they're selling that to these industries so that they can be targeted with their marketing to consume and engage in these products more and more. So in terms of what we can do about that, Again, in the commercial determinants health chapter, we talked about the role of protecting children and adults as well from the harmful impacts of unhealthy advertising, digital advertising, through government-led mandatory regulations, and we certainly need to continue with that sort of advocacy, and VicHealth's doing a lot of work in that area, but make sure that they're future-proof to the ways in which the industry will be using these technologies in the future. We also have to think about privacy and digital privacy. So at the moment, Australia is really dependent on the 1988 Privacy Act. This was an act that was put together before the internet was even developed, and although there's been a few amendments, it's still not fit for purpose in the digital sphere, and it's under review at the moment, but it'll be really important that it protects digital rights and privacy to information and how our information's being used. So just to wrap up, I think we've made huge progress with digital technologies and population health, and the benefits will continue to be groundbreaking. As with each of the past industrial revolutions, the digital transformation has the potential to raise income levels and profoundly influence public health research, policy and practice. And we need to continue with that momentum, but we need to do so in a way that prioritises health over profits and in a way that leaves no one behind.
6 minutes really is tricky to cover some pretty big issues, but thank you to our speakers for making the very valid attempt. I'll now invite our panel to the stage to further the discussion and really unpack some of the themes that we've just heard about and some others that come up through the supplement. A quick reminder to everyone in the room and online to submit or like your questions via Slido so that we can get them into the Q&A section. But let's please welcome back Dr. Summer Finlay. Joining her on the panel is Professor Billie Giles-Corti, Vice-Chancellor's Professorial Research Fellow at RMIT University, Dr. Adele Murdolo, Executive Director of the Multicultural Centre for Women's Health, and Mr. Ahmed Dini, Chairman of United Through Football. Please welcome our panel, make them feel at home. So the clear message in the supplement is that the time to act is now. There's a real sense of urgency, but also I feel one of hope, as the pandemic has really shone a spotlight on public health, creating some much needed momentum. So I wanted to unpack that a little bit first with you all. Professor Giles-Corti, first question's for you, first up. Do you think the pandemic has got us thinking more or less about the impacts of climate change and its role in current planning practices?
I think that actually what the pandemic has reinforced the importance of transitioning, but I think it's distracted us a little bit. My sense is that we had a visceral response to climate change in 2020. I think people were reeling. I mean, when you hear the that was a great talk, enormous impacts that we've experienced, it really highlighted that, and the community responded to that. And we have a lot of public support for action. I think what COVID did was actually reinforce the reason that we need to transition. I mean, people suddenly started to appreciate public open space. They suddenly started to appreciate local living. So from an urban design, which is my area, it's a city planning perspective, I think it reinforced this idea of transitioning to cities that supported people to use active forms of transportation. People really valued it. They really valued public open spaces. It's really important for heat island, the adaptation part for heat island effects. There was this groundswell of community support. I think what it reinforced then, COVID really reinforced in my area, the co-benefits of transitioning to cities that support people's health and well-being and are more sustainable. And I think what really needs to happen now is for us to really take this seriously. And what we've seen with COVID is that when people work together, when governments work together, when there's cross-sector collaboration, when there's, there's vertical integration of activity. So, for example, the federal government working with the state government, working with local government, that's when you get an effective response. And that's exactly what we need for climate change. That's exactly what we need for city planning. And what we need from our political leaders now is to create that authorising environment. I know amongst this audience there are people who are trying to do those things. But I also know that it's difficult to do that because we don't have the authorising environment for it. And that's a really critical thing that we need for political leaders, to create the authorising environment so that people can work together to deliver the cities or to do the interventions that we need to transition us urgently to where we need. And I think for the health sector, if we want to participate in this, we really need to train ourselves. We really need to get on top of the issues. What we saw were the experts. Suddenly we were really valuing evidence, and we saw how fantastic it was that when evidence is there and when it's used, we can have an effective response. What a wonderful thing. I think in all of our areas, all the areas we've talked about, this is really critical. And I think in my area for city planning and health, having this, the health sector preparing itself with great evidence is a really critical thing that we need to be preparing ourselves to participate, because I think in climate change we really know what the evidence says about what we should do and then taking that forward. But I think we've got a way to go before I think we need to, as a health sector, really start to get ourselves prepared to be part of this conversation.
Yeah. And you mentioned evidence, and I was incredibly interested, Dr. Finlay, to hear about the response from Aboriginal community-controlled organisations during COVID and the percentages that have happened. So if we think about the cultural determinants of health, in your view, has the pandemic fast-tracked or stifled progress in that space?
In terms of the cultural determinants of health, there's a lot of work that's been happening and is continuing to happen over time. I don't think that it has that COVID has stifled it. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people it has always been the time to address Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people's health. It is the time now. It was the time when my mother was younger and my age. And this is something that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people have been talking about and waiting for. We are seeing a large amount of movement in this space, particularly around the cultural determinants of health. We had the My Life, My Lead report, which was put out under Minister Wyatt when he was the Minister for Indigenous Health. We're now seeing that in the new iteration of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Health Plan, that there is also a focus on cultural determinants of health. What the COVID pandemic has done is really provided a case study for mainstream services to understand that, maybe they're not best placed to do this, and maybe our ACCHO sectors are. So it certainly hasn't stifled. It has certainly solidified the need to make sure that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander leadership is actually at the forefront of anything that's happening, and also demonstrated that when you get something right, like the health communication during COVID with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, which was led predominantly initially by, as I said, the ACCHO sector, there was health promotion resources in language, and we know how well the government does with translating health promotion resources. We know that they had a pandemic response at the AH and MRC, the Aboriginal Health and Medical Research Council, as early as March. And again, it focused on what needed to keep our community safe. So I don't think it's stifled, and I'm not sure it's accelerated, but I think it has provided a case study. If people are willing to listen to that, it will provide a platform to understand how that can be done and the benefits of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander leadership.
Yeah, fantastic. And Dr. Murdolo, your time at the Multicultural Centre for Women's Health, you would have seen, no doubt, a variety of changes, variety of challenges. How problematic has the pandemic's effect been on the health and wellbeing of women from multicultural backgrounds?
Look, I think it was quite devastating for many migrant communities, and particularly those who were living in the north and west of Melbourne in Victoria. But none of it was a surprise. And in fact, at the very beginning of the pandemic, well, actually before things had closed down, myself and the chair of my board at Multicultural Centre for Women's Health held a meeting with our representative at the Department of Health, and we're really starting sounding the alarm. You know, we were really saying, look, we really need to make sure that women from migrant communities have the information they need about COVID-19, because it's not going to get out there by putting stuff on websites. And the response that we had at the time was, look, the department's just restructured, you know, this is what you need to know, and we're just going to have to hope that the information gets out there. And, you know, when I kind of picked my jaw up off the floor when she said that hope was the strategy, I guess, you know, we know how hope works out for people, especially when they're disadvantaged. So it was no surprise. And the challenges that migrant women have always faced is intersecting gender and race discrimination, which of course leads to inequity in the health system. So we know that there's much less access to information, much less access to early intervention and prevention services, and then we see the results in the acute sector. So antenatal care is one example where only 55% of migrant women across Australia access antenatal care in the first trimester. And then, of course, we see in the acute sector, we see very poor or poorer than other women's birth outcomes, higher rates of stillbirth. We see, you know, more birth intervention, etc. So what we've seen with COVID is, of course, very limited access to health information in people's language, as well as working in those kinds of jobs that couldn't work from home. So, you know, migrant women became our essential service providers. And then, of course, we see at the other end in Victoria where over 50% of people infected by COVID were born overseas from migrant backgrounds. So I guess we saw a similar pattern. So I would say that the challenges were highlighted, but nothing surprising for people who are working in that field and who are involved with migrant communities.
Hope was the strategy. That's we need a little bit more than that. Mr. Dini, so you work with migrant communities, multicultural communities, really directly at the coalface, I suppose. Could you tell us a little bit about United Through Football and the impact that that program has had with the community?
Yeah, well, thank you. I just probably wanted to also start and talk about just the effects of COVID-19 and what it had just basically on community. I actually all the work that I do is around public housing, and everybody's probably knows what happened with public housing last year in July. I actually was one of the tower residents at that time. I lived in one of the North Melbourne towers, and I think for us, it's really amazing because it was down around March that year in 2020 that we as a group of community leaders went to government and actually talked to them about that we needed, because there was issues with Somali community members in London who were coming down with COVID, and Sweden. So we already knew that members of our community were coming down with COVID back overseas in Europe. And when we had those conversations, it was really adamant. Like for us, it was like, you guys need to do something about public housing. Because the thing is, we knew the environment that we live in. Like, no, we didn't, we kind of explained it to them. Like, if COVID was to take place in these towers, that, a lot of members of the community will come down with the virus. So, but the same thing, we were told like, oh, that's going to happen in due course, we'll make sure that it happens and all that kind of stuff. And then July comes and there wasn't even translated information that was available to members of the community. The first translated languages of the various communities, the Vietnamese, Chinese, Somali, Eritrean, Ethiopian communities that were actually living in those towers, and Turkish communities, came 14 days after the hard lockdown. So you can just imagine, before that, you expect DHHS, now changed to DFFH and DOH, would have known the people that they were dealing with. But also for us as a community and the work that I do in particular, because I work with young people from various different backgrounds nonetheless, but who might have a parent who was a refugee, majority of them born in this country, so fair dinkum Aussies. But nonetheless, we're dealing with, especially in those towers, we're dealing with 60% unemployment among young people, and 50% unemployment with the entire population. So also, so when you talk about health determinations for members of those communities who live in public housing or people from low socio-income communities, the last thing they think about is climate change. The last thing they think about is what I am going to do in 2030. It's right now, what should I get my hands on? So in terms of unemployment of 62%, and mind you, this is government numbers. I'm not just quoting them. This is what the government has told us, community leaders. This is a human rights issue to a certain extent. But nonetheless, when you translate that into what you should participate in as an individual in terms of trying to get your health right. So if you're an African woman or Eritrean, or Afghani women or women from Asia continent who lives in those towers and wants to participate in some sort of an exercise, a form of exercise, or join a yoga and stuff like that, that's impossible. You don't think of those kind of things. I'll probably finish with this. We run a football team down at the Towers in Flemington. We have 2 teams registered this year. So we have a choice where parents make every year which child should play because they can't afford to pay for the fees. Because the football, the round ball, soccer, is probably the most expensive sport to play in Australia or in Victoria, to be honest with you. Because, you go join a local club in suburbia, or, some of the kids, like I try to help and we try to sponsor some kids around that. They're asking for $2,000 per child. So you can imagine a parent who's a single mother who has about 5 kids, 3 of them could be boys. Some of the members that we work with actually have 8 to 9, sometimes 10 kids, right? So you got to make the choice of which child should play this year. The time he gets back into football is probably 6 years down the track because of his other siblings also needs to enjoy that year of football. So this kind of thing. So in terms of health determinations and cultural determinations, stuff like that, it's like there's cohorts of Victorians who seem to be being left behind. But the thing is, there's resilience there at the same time because of what we achieved and what we showed government as well. Because the doctor was speaking before about how Indigenous people showed the government that, once you take upon yourself and say, we can do this, like you can actually show people who don't expect you to do things that you're capable of doing something. And the hard lockdown showed government and all the service providers that as a community, we have the knowledge, we have the tools, we're rich in so many ways, and if given or empowered, that we can ultimately be the ones who are, in control of their own destiny. So yeah, thank you.
Yeah. So late last year, VicHealth was privileged enough to award a Reimagining Health grant to United Through Football. Can you talk to us a little bit about how that helped in these circumstances and what you did with that money to support the community?
Yeah, so well, that's a lot of money, and it did quite, it really helped us because of, we came out of the hard lockdown for a very long time. We weren't able to do anything. So during January, when things were just going back to normal, we were able to organize some sort of a gathering for young men, especially young men, to come together especially from the towers, not just this in particular 9 towers, but also we included Fitzroy, Carlton, and Collingwood to actually participate in that. And we had over 120 young men participate in that program. It was over 3 weeks, where it was just a mini kind of a tournament where we just got them together to, because for us, one of the things we were dealing with straight after the aftermath of the whole lockdown was mental health issues, because you had a lot of these people who were just basically locked into their own houses, who weren't leaving. And you remember when we came out of the hard lockdown, the whole of Victoria went to stage 4. So you can imagine people still staying in those what the government described as vertical cruise ships, right? And so you had family members of 11 who were living in 3 bedrooms. So we just needed to ensure that members of the community, once they came out, were able to just quickly get involved in something that they knew about, something that they were particularly fond about, and that's football for a lot of the young men. Currently, right now, because it's amazing because it deals with the time, we're actually running a program for 80 young women from across Melbourne. It's not just from the towers, but with young women, because of the cultural practices and conservative communities in terms of religion and cultural identity, the money was able to help us hire an entire space where the women just where they're just themselves, the young women are themselves, and they're playing football, they're playing basketball, you know, they're just being themselves. And it's the first time, a lot of the girls, some of the quotes that we had was, this is the first time I actually felt like I could take my scarf off without worrying about, you know, the ramifications of, you know, who's looking at me, who's judging me and stuff like that. And it's just other young women from, you know, cultural backgrounds who she was enjoying with herself. And at the same time, you know, we've got other programs throughout the year. You know, we're in the middle of Ramadan now. Ramadan is it's probably got about 7 days left and stuff like that. So we were also observing Ramadan at the same time, where a lot of young men and women in the community help their parents, in particular prepare meals. And it's a time where we spend time together and also basically come, you know, to share ideas and stories, and also overcome things that we went through. So it's a lot of stories about the hard lockdown that's actually happening in the towers now, through people sharing meals when the sun sets in the evenings. And we've got, you know, camps organised for young men and women in the community. We've got a swimming programs organised for a lot of the elder mums, because we have to, obviously, because the thing is, without the mums in our communities, we wouldn't actually get anywhere, to be honest with you. And I get emotional when I talk about the women of my community, but they are the reason why we stand. And knowing that we can do something for them, it's just really it really brings joy to my heart, because it was the matriarchs, the women are the matriarchs of our community, and they sacrificed everything to get us to this country. And I couldn't thank them enough, so yeah.
Thank you. You're doing... I'm going to need a moment too now. You're doing some really amazing work. Thank you for sharing all of that with us. We have a whole heap of really fantastic questions coming through on Slido, so thank you to those in the room and online. Because we've got so many great questions, we are going to run 5 to 10 minutes over, so hopefully those online can stay with us, because I mean, I for one could just listen to the four of you all day, but we won't make you stay all day. The top question that we've got here, and we might go back to Dr. Finlay and then through each of you. What is the one policy action that you would like the health sector to advocate for? Nice, easy one.
Yeah, I love the easy ones. To be honest with you, it is what I've said before. The one thing that we actually need to see from a policy space, and to be honest with you, this applies not just to policy, but program development, research, and evaluations, by the way. I know you all do evaluations without us, but you do them about us. Is actually making sure that there is strong, diverse Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander leadership, actually empowered, not empowered, we actually already empowered. You just need to make the space for us, where we can then make the decisions that need to be made for our communities. And I have to say, and why I say diverse is because there is not a single Aboriginal person that is the fountain of all knowledges on Aboriginal people. It's not me, there's not a single person. We need to make sure that while I'm just sitting here talking to you, I have to say to you, you need to go and talk to the local people in your communities. You need to be making sure that you get diverse input, because there will be a range of needs across all of the communities. And I like to say to people, if you're really not, sure about that and you're really thinking, well, we can only afford one person, can I just say to you, stop and think about whether or not you would be happy for Tony Abbott, as the former Pre-Am, to speak on behalf of all you white fellas in Australia. If you're happy with that, pick one Aboriginal person. If you're not, which I suspect most of you probably aren't, think about making sure you resource it adequately to get a diverse group of Aboriginal people together.
Fantastic. Professor Giles-Corti?
So from my point of view, the one action would be action on climate change. This is not a rehearsal. Things are changing on our watch, and the one thing that we can do in the health sector is to be advocating for... The thing is that in the health sector, we will have to deal with the problems. We're going to have to patch people up. We're going to have to support people. But what we need to be doing in the health sector is focusing on prevention. What can we do to participate? And we need to be advocating for creating the authorising environment so that we can have intersectoral action. And then we need to train ourselves, train all of our people to be able to participate in those conversations, because it's not just about saying it. We need to understand the evidence, and we need to be able to say for the different sectors what they need to do to transition to be able to act on climate change. I mean, my area is urban design and health, or planning and health, but that's a very complicated topic. And we in the health sector across all the different health sectors, need to be aware of that. So I think climate change action is really something that I think the health sector needs to be upfront with.
Yep, great. Dr. Murdolo?
Well, I hope we can have 4 because I agree with everything that's been said so far, but I've got my own. So as we head up into to budgets, May is always budget time, I'm going to make a comment about investment, and I'd really like to see more investment in building capacity of migrant women themselves to take control of their own health. So, you know, very similar to the ACCHO organisations, we need to see these kinds of organisations run by migrant women, for migrant women, to build advocacy capacity. We need to be able to do our own research. We need to make sure that migrant women's lived experience and points of view are considered within policy. And I'll give an example. You know, throughout COVID, we had problems with, you know, who was going to pick the fruit. We still have those problems. But very much in the media, we heard that from the point of view of farmers. You know, who's going to pick our fruit? Because we don't have temporary migrants to do that. But we really also need to hear that same problem from the perspective of migrant women, which is not who's going to pick our fruit. I mean, although they would be concerned about that as well. But how am I supposed to get a living wage from this work? You know, the reason why you can't get somebody to pick your fruit is because you're not paying what needs to be paid. So I'm not bagging the farmers. Sorry, I don't have a lot of time, so I don't want to make it sound like I'm bagging farmers. It's obviously a systemic issue about supply and monopoly and a whole range of different things. But we need to hear about those issues from migrant women so that we can incorporate the solutions into policy. So my call is for investment. In Victoria, our organisation, which is the only Victorian organisation that's run by and for migrant women to promote health, we've gone from around $1.62 per migrant woman in Victoria to around 60 cents in 2020 per migrant woman. So the population's boomed, our funding hasn't kept up. So we're calling on governments to keep up with the population growth and really invest in infrastructure, invest in making sure that migrant women are able to take control of their own health. So migrant women's health in migrant women's hands would be my one policy solution.
Mr. Dini, what's your one policy action that you want to see?
I agree with everybody, but I think I'll probably also quite similar, but representation. I think, you know, you need to see yourself around the table where decisions are being made. So policies are being written on behalf of you know, communities that are far from the table that decisions are being made from. So, you know, to have a representation of, you know, cultural intellect, cultural ideas on the table and stuff like that. Because ultimately, you know, and I agree a lot with Dr. Finlay, because it seems like we share a lot of things in terms of when we talk about certain communities, is that fact that, you know, if you give these communities the importance and the empowerment that they need, you know, the Indigenous community probably doesn't need that empowerment, as Dr. Finlay suggested. They're already ready, they're there. But communities who come to this country as refugees in the last 30 years and stuff like that, it's about empowerment for us. We're asking, we do have the resources in hand, we have the individuals. It's just about saying, you know, let us also be given a table, a seat on the table where decisions and policies are being produced, so we can put, you know, we can have a cultural input onto it. So yeah.
Fantastic, definitely a clear theme coming out. Next question is around, I might get Dr. Finlay to answer this one. How are we measuring improvement in health, and how are we measuring any change in equity? Or perhaps it's best framed as, how should we be measuring improvement in health and equity?
That's a really big question, and it's actually something that, thinking about it from a cultural determinants lens as well, how do we actually measure the way we actually embed cultural determinants? Often the measurements are created from a dominant culture perspective, looking at what's important from a dominant culture perspective, or for those that might be epidemiologists or focus on numbers, actually talking about the numbers without looking at the story behind the numbers. So in terms of measurement, I think we need to become more sophisticated in our measurements. And I wish Ray Lovett was here, because he is an epidemiologist and a social epidemiologist who is working on specifically how do we measure the cultural determinants of health through his Microwise study, in addition to all of the other amazing things that he does. So we really need to be making sure that we're thinking about what it is that's important from the people we're actually talking about measuring, rather than what's important from a government perspective, or what's important from a non-Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander and probably other groups in Australia as well. And I don't want to speak for them, but I would imagine that their needs are going to be different. So for me, when we look at numbers, and I dabble in numbers, but it's not my area of expertise, that we need to be always thinking about numbers aren't just numbers. They tell a story. The way you collect the data, the questions that are asked, which goes to Indigenous data sovereignty, for example, which is the need for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people to actually control the data right from the get-go in terms of what's being asked. We need to be making sure that we are developing the mechanisms that ask the questions Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people want to ask, and other members of our community, to make sure we're actually measuring what's important to them, not just what people think is important to them, or what's actually just important to government. And so it's probably not quite answering your question, but it is a complex question, and we haven't quite got there in terms of measurement, and there's a lot more work that needs to be done in this space.
It's, the idea of reframing the way we measure rather than just how do we measure and get down to the specific questions. I think that's fascinating. Conscious of time, so I might just ask one final question for each of you, which is, there's a sense of momentum coming out of the supplement, that COVID has given us this momentum. We've got this roadmap, this supplement. We've got these ideas across all of the determinants of what needs to happen. We've got a spotlight. We've had this supplement has had so much coverage in the media, and thank you to our co-authors that have helped us get that out and generate the conversation. How confident are you that we will act, that we can act on this roadmap and really drive change and create a healthier future for all by 2030? Mr. Dini, I might start with you.
Well, I'm hopeful. I'm very optimistic. That's basically for me, to be honest with you. You know, as humans, we just gotta be optimistic about, you know, changes that we make to our lives, and to ensure that, you know, we create a greater and for a thriving and a very healthy community for all Australians. For me, but you know, there's obviously going to be a lot of challenges, a lot of hurdles to overcome. But that's where, you know, the things that we spoke about, especially about the policies and ensuring there's representation around those policies, there's leadership, you know, there's empowerment is going to be very, very vital. Because it's one thing if it's left on paper and, you know, we just read it in our living rooms and stuff like that, or if government looks at it and says, you know, we're just going to do things the old way. I think, you know, what COVID-19 also, as bad as it was, what COVID-19 has, you know, given humans is that, you know, it's a reset, right? Because, you know, we've been at this path. You know, there was this thing about us that way we just do things, we just 9 to 5 things. You know, we just go to the office and we just follow policies and procedures that were just handed down to us. But now we've got a whole conversation going around. You know, how the world has changed, and you look at the fact that we can't even travel out our own country. A lot of us would have loved to be somewhere in the other side of the world. That winter is approaching now, but there's things that we've used to take for granted that we can't take for granted anymore. But the thing is, at the same time, to be honest with you, and I don't want to dampen anyone's spirits, but there's people in this country, you know, Indigenous people in particular, who felt like that for a very long time, you know, and this, you know, nature resets itself because it's trying to teach us a lesson. And that's how I see it, to be honest with you. And when nature takes control, and when these invisible diseases come out of nowhere, and we're all grappling of how should we get our lives back together, then that's when we stop and to rethink and reimagine what type of world we want to live in. And if we want to live in a better and more welcoming, more thriving, and a far healthier Australia, then obviously we also need to make sure that we take our part as individuals, but also collectively as organizations, to make sure that no one's also left behind. So yeah, thank you.
Fantastic. Dr. Murdolo?
I think one of the things that COVID showed us was how connected we all are. So how, you know, precarious employment, for example, which, you know, perhaps before COVID we just would have seen as a problem for those who are precariously employed, became a problem for the whole community because it affected the way that hotel quarantine operated safely, etc. So, and, you know, we know as well that if you do get virus in the northern suburbs, you're going to eventually get virus in Toorak. So we're all connected in terms of our health. And I think that if we are able to stay aware of that issue, that, one person's problem is everybody's problem. And, unless we can make sure that that person's problem is resolved before that I guess that's just a plea for health equity, then, we're not going to get to where we need to get. So in terms of whether we'll solve the world's problems by 2030, I'm not as hopeful, I'm sorry. but I do think that we can get on the track towards it. So, it's going to take a long time to dismantle the kind of toxic health system that we have so far. Sorry, that's a very negative view of it, but I do think that there's a lot of changes that need to be made. And now, and I guess I've got the climate issue front of mind as well, that now's the time we need to act with all of it, because, things are going pretty pear-shaped pretty quickly. So I'd like to, start with that principle that we're all connected, that we need to, build on that awareness so that we can develop an equitable health system, but it takes a long time.
How confident are you?
Well, I do feel optimistic. I think COVID's been fantastic. It's told us that we can work from home and that we're going to probably enjoy our work a little bit more when we have some home time. We told them there were some vulnerabilities in our cities when we build really small apartments, when families live there. We are very vulnerable. It showed up our vulnerabilities as well. But suddenly because we can work from home, we can work in regional cities. And so suddenly in Australia, we only have capital cities, but now we could have stronger regional cities, which means that some families may prefer to live in regional cities. It's told us that we can have better government when government works together, so the federal government works in the state and with the local government. It's told us that better governance produces better results, even though we've had some wobbles, but nevertheless, it's been better than what we would normally do. It's told us that if we use evidence, we produce a better result, and that evidence is worthwhile. And I think the community, I love all these armchair epidemiologists. It's wonderful to see all these armchair epidemiologists looking at the evidence, looking at the curve. Can we flatten the curve, and having their opinion. Fantastic. So it's told us that we can do things in a different way. And in that sense, it gives me confidence. The question is for us, how do we capitalise on that now? And I think while we've got the momentum, it's really incumbent on all of us to continue the conversations. I am interested in climate change, obviously, not interested, but concerned about it. How do we have the conversations to talk to government, to advocate to government about how we want things to be different to our political leaders? Because at the end of the day, they make decisions. But I think in our professional roles, I think we've been given a bit of a window where we've done things differently, and we've got a better result as a result of that. I think the one thing that alarms me with climate change, we've had a good public health system and we've contained it. Climate change is not like that. This is the tragedy of the commons. It's the decisions that we all make that will have and that's what's different about this big issue, climate change, to other issues. So I think we need to learn from that. I need to take the lessons from COVID, but also we all need to take action, even if it's not affecting us directly. We can see it, unlike COVID. We need to actually take action, and that's a harder sell, but I think there's an opportunity.
Great. And finally, Dr. Finlay.
I'll try and keep it brief. I know we're well over time. I'm hopeful but realistic. We have to have hope, otherwise why would we bother? But I'm realistic that we have an opportunity here to capitalise on the successes of COVID, as well as recognising maybe the wobbles and what we need to do differently. But my concern is that we will grow complacent, that we will forget that COVID impacted us so significantly. And for those that are young people, go back out on the dance floor. But, those that are older, actually just start doing what we always did. So I am hopeful that these memories will live in the minds, and actually the way we need to do business going forward will stay in the minds. But at the same time, I do, because Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander history tells us that there are often huge leaps forward, and then there's stalls, and sometimes there's going backwards. So I think this is needing a concerted effort from every single person, whether it is on climate change, on migrant health, as well as Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander health, to put front in mind the most vulnerable people within our society. As a country, if we are measured by the health and well-being of the most vulnerable people in our society and we're doing well, then the country's doing well. So until we can say that, then we aren't doing well as a country. So I think we always need to remember the wobbles that we had, those that have been most affected by COVID, but also the success stories and how they were achieved. And then I think we're actually going to see a better 2030.
Thank you very much. Join me again in thanking all of our speakers and panel members. Well, that does conclude the launch event, Australia in 2030, What is Our Path to Better Health for All? I hope you're all feeling inspired, realistically optimistic, hopeful, confident. I'd like to thank again our authors and speakers today for their contributions and for their passion. And I'd like to thank each of you for coming, including those that joined online. If you want to hear more, a lot of the speakers and presenters and co-authors have been joining the conversation in the media. We will share some of those links so that you can delve a little bit deeper into these issues. Please read the supplement, of course. Although we finish here today, there is still so much work to be done, as you've heard. As we recover from the events of 2020, we have a chance to invoke real change, but we must act now. By using the current momentum, we can take bold action and we can build back better, fairer and greener. A healthy, sustainable, equitable, prosperous Australia is possible because we know what causes good health and well-being. By seizing this window of opportunity, we can create a post-pandemic pathway to health for all in 2030. Thank you for joining us on that journey. Thanks, everybody.